The auction house buzzed with the usual crowd that Sunday morning. Dealers in pressed shirts, families looking for a first pony, and the serious equestrians who could spot a champion from across the room. But in the corner stood a figure who didn't quite fit in. Old Jim, as everyone in the county called him. His weathered hands clasped the auction catalog, eyes fixed on pen number 7, where a bay mare stood ignored by the passing crowd. Lot 43, starting bid $300, the auctioneer announced with little enthusiasm. The horse wasn't much to look at, slightly underweight, dull coat, and an odd pattern of white markings that scattered across her flanks like someone had splashed her with paint. The crowd barely stirred. No hands went up. $250 then? Anyone for $250? From the back, old Jim's hand rose slowly. No competing bids followed. The gavel struck with a hollow sound. Sold to the gentleman in the back. People whispered as Jim led the mare to his trailer. Why would he want such an unremarkable animal? His farm was modest, his days of breeding champions long behind him. Some laughed. Assuming age had finally clouded the old farmer's legendary eye for horseflesh. But Jim wasn't seeing what they saw. From the moment he spotted those peculiar white markings, something stirred in his memory. A story his grandfather had told him as a boy. A story about horses marked by the stars, carrying secrets from civilizations long forgotten. Back at his farm, Jim carefully brushed the mare's coat, revealing the markings more clearly in the fading evening light. The pattern seemed random at first glance, irregular white patches scattered across her chestnut hide. But as dusk settled, and the first stars appeared in the sky, Jim stepped back and gasped. The markings weren't random at all. They formed a pattern, precise points connected by subtle lines of white hairs. Jim's hands trembled as he reached for an old book on his shelf, its leather binding cracked with age. Inside were hand-drawn star charts from centuries past. He held the open book next to the horse's flank and watched in amazement as the patterns aligned perfectly. Not just any constellation, these were navigational markers used by ancient peoples to find something hidden, something valuable. This wasn't just a horse with strange markings. This creature carried a map on her very skin. A map that had been carefully bred into her bloodline for generations, preserved through selective breeding by people who understood its significance. News of Jim's unusual purchase spread through the community. Most folks just shook their heads, thinking the old farmer had finally lost his senses, wasting money on a scraggly mare with odd coloring. But a few others started watching Jim's farm with curious eyes, including one stranger who seemed particularly interested in photographing the horse from a distance. What Jim didn't realize as he traced the celestial pattern with trembling fingers was that he wasn't the only one who recognized these ancient markings, and not everyone searching for this equine map had honorable intentions for the secret it revealed. That night, Jim barely slept. The book lay open on his kitchen table, its yellow pages illuminated by a single lamp as he cross-referenced the markings against ancient star charts. His grandfather's stories flooded back to him, tales told around crackling fires about horses bred by ancient civilizations, living maps that couldn't be stolen or destroyed. The constellations changed their position, but the stars remained constant, his grandfather used to say. Those who understood the heavens knew how to hide their greatest treasures. Jim's small farmhouse sat on land his family had worked for 4 generations. The neighboring properties had all been sold off to developers or larger agricultural operations, but Jim had stubbornly held on to his modest acreage, despite numerous offers. Something about this place had always felt important, though he could never explain why. Dawn broke with golden light streaming through Jim's kitchen window. He'd fallen asleep at the table, sheet pressed against the ancient book. Outside, the mare nickered softly. Jim rubbed his eyes and shuffled to the barn, coffee mug in hand. The horse looked different in the morning light, stronger somehow, her eyes clearer. She nuzzled Jim's pocket for treats, acting like she'd known him for years rather than hours. "What's your story, girl?" Jim whispered, running his hand along her neck. "What secret are you carrying?" As the day warmed, Jim noticed a black sedan driving slowly past his property. It circled back an hour later. By mid-afternoon, a woman in her 40s with city clothes and an expensive camera had parked at the end of his drive, pretending to photograph wildflowers while clearly focusing her lens on his barn. Jim wasn't the only one who'd recognized the markings. The question was, how many others knew what they meant? That evening, Jim's only visitor was Doc Reynolds, the local veterinarian and his oldest friend. They'd gone to school together before Doc went off to veterinary college and Jim stayed behind to work the farm. "Heard you bought yourself a map horse," Doc said without preamble, setting his medical bag on a hay bale. Jim nearly dropped the brush he was holding. "You know about them?" Doc nodded slowly. "My grandmother was Navajo. She told me stories about the star horses. Said they were bred by her ancestors to preserve the locations of sacred places." He paused, studying the mare's flank. "Never thought I'd actually see one." "What exactly are they supposed to lead to?" Jim asked. "Depends on the markings. Some led to water sources that never ran dry. Others to mineral deposits. The most valuable ones," Doc's voice dropped to a whisper, "those led to places where the star people left their knowledge." A branch snapped outside the barn. Both men froze. Through the open door, Jim caught sight of a shadow retreating around the corner. "You're not safe, Jim," Doc said urgently. "These horses are rare for a reason. Most were hunted down and destroyed centuries ago by people who didn't want their secrets found." Doc reached into his bag and pulled out a tattered envelope. "My grandmother gave me this before she died. Said if I ever encountered a star horse, I should open it." His hands trembled slightly as he broke the wax seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a hand-drawn symbol, the exact same pattern that formed the centerpiece of the mare's constellation markings. Before Jim could respond, headlights swept across the barn entrance as several vehicles pulled into his driveway. Jim and Doc froze as the vehicles crunched to a halt on the gravel driveway. 3 black SUVs formed a half-circle around the barn entrance, their headlights creating long shadows across the weathered wooden floor. Jim quickly led the mare into the back stall, away from sight. "Jim Harlow?" A woman's voice called out. She stepped into the light, tall, confident, wearing a navy blazer despite the evening heat. "My name is Eleanor West, Department of Historical Preservation." She flashed an official-looking badge too quickly to read. "We need to talk about the horse you purchased today." Doc shot Jim a warning glance. Something wasn't right. "My property's private," Jim replied, positioning himself between the visitors and the back stalls, "and it's getting late for government business." Eleanor smiled thinly. "This is rather urgent. That animal may possess historical significance that requires immediate documentation." From the shadows behind her emerged 2 men in similar professional attire, tablets in hand. Without asking permission, they began photographing the barn interior. "Hold on now." Doc stepped forward. "You can't just barge in here without—" "Actually, we can," Eleanor interrupted, producing a document. "This gives us temporary authority to examine potential artifacts of historical significance. Your horse's markings match a pattern we've been tracking for years." Jim felt his stomach tighten. How had they known about the mare so quickly? The auction had only been that morning. "I think you folks should leave," Jim said firmly. "Come back tomorrow with proper paperwork. My lawyer will want to see it." Eleanor's smile disappeared. "Mr. Harlow, you don't understand what you've stumbled upon. Those markings aren't just interesting, they're part of a star map that's been sought after for centuries. My team has dedicated their careers to finding horses like yours." Outside, a truck engine roared to life. Jim recognized the sound of his neighbor Tom's pickup. It idled for a moment near the property line before speeding away. Had Tom been watching? Doc cleared his throat. "If this is legitimate government business, you wouldn't mind if I called the sheriff to verify, would you?" One of the men stepped forward urgently and whispered something in Eleanor's ear. Her expression hardened. "Very well. We'll return in the morning with all the necessary documentation." She handed Jim a business card. "Don't do anything with that horse until we've spoken again, for your own safety." After they left, Doc locked the barn door behind them. "They're not government," he said quietly. "How can you tell?" Badge was wrong. "I've worked with historical preservation before on the reservation. Different logo, different ID format." Doc looked troubled. "Someone tipped them off, Jim. Someone at that auction." Later that night, after Doc left, Jim sat in the dark on his porch, shotgun across his lap. The mare's pattern kept running through his mind, along with his grandfather's stories and Doc's grandmother's warnings. What knowledge could be so valuable that people would track down a horse bearing its map centuries later? Just after midnight, his phone rang. "Jim? It's Beth from the feed store." Her voice sounded urgent. "Listen, there's people in town asking questions about you and that horse. Not just at the diner, but at the library too, looking through old county records, land surveys of your property." "What do they want with land surveys?" Jim asked. "I don't know, but Tom overheard them talking about some kind of underground structure that might be on your land. Something about alignment with the summer solstice." Beth paused. "Jim, they said your farm sits on what used to be sacred ground." Jim's blood ran cold. The barn, the way his grandfather had insisted it be built at that precise spot on their property, aligned exactly with the rising sun on the longest day of the year. As Jim hung up, headlights appeared at the end of his long driveway. But these weren't the black SUVs from before. It was an old truck he didn't recognize, moving slowly with its lights dimmed. The driver stopped 100 yards away and flashed the lights 3 times. A signal. Jim hesitated, then grabbed the flashlight and returned the signal. The truck began moving forward again, and as it drew closer, Jim could make out an elderly Native American man at the wheel, with a young woman beside him. The truck stopped, and the woman stepped out, her eyes finding Jim's immediately. "We're friends of Doc Reynolds," she said, "and we know what your horse is carrying. The people who came here earlier, they'll be back with others by dawn. We don't have much time." Behind her, the old man was already unloading what looked like ancient tools and a star chart much older than the one in Jim's book. "Time for what?" Jim asked. The woman glanced at the night sky. "The alignment happens tonight, the first time in 70 years. If we miss it, the door will remain sealed until our grandchildren's time." From inside the barn, the mare suddenly whinnied. A sound of recognition, not fear. The old man smiled. "She knows. The horses always know when it's time." Jim looked from the stranger to his barn, where somewhere beneath the floorboards, an ancient secret had been waiting all this time, perhaps the reason his family had held on to this particular piece of land for generations. In the distance, the sound of many vehicles approaching fast broke the night's stillness. "Inside quickly," Jim urged, ushering the newcomers toward the barn. The approaching vehicles were still a minute away, their headlights bouncing along the country road that led to his property. The young woman introduced herself as Nora, Doc Reynolds' niece, while the elderly man was Joseph, a tribal elder who had been keeping watch for star horses his entire life. "My family has protected this knowledge for 15 generations," Joseph explained as they hurried across the yard. "We knew one day a marked horse would return when the time was right." Inside the barn, the mare stamped her hooves nervously, sensing the urgency in the air. Joseph approached her with reverence, speaking softly in a language Jim didn't understand. The horse calmed immediately, lowering her head toward the old man's outstretched hand. "She recognizes the words," Nora whispered. The keepers of the horses were taught special phrases, passed down through the centuries. Joseph traced the pattern on the mare's flank, his weathered fingers following the constellation with practiced precision. "The arrangement is complete. This one shows the exact location and the time." He looked up at the barn roof, as if seeing through it to the stars above. "Tonight is when the heavens align, when the doorway can be opened." Jim's mind raced. Doorway to what? Before Joseph could answer, the sound of vehicles pulling into the driveway silenced them all. Headlights swept across the barn windows. "Back door," Jim whispered, leading them through the storage area, to a smaller exit at the rear of the building. The mare followed obediently, her hooves muffled by the soft hay covering the floor. Outside, Joseph pointed to a spot about 50 yards from the barn, an unremarkable patch of ground covered in tall grass and wildflowers. "There, that's where it lies." "What about those people?" Jim nodded toward the approaching flashlight beams as Eleanor's team spread out around his property. "They won't find anything without the horse in the proper alignment," Joseph said. "The entrance only reveals itself when all elements come together: the star pattern, the marked horse, the correct words, and the exact moment of celestial alignment." They crouched low in the tall grass as Eleanor's team entered the barn. Angry shouts erupted when they discovered it empty. "We have 20 minutes until the alignment," Nora whispered, checking her watch. "Once it starts, we'll have a 5-minute window at most." Jim noticed more vehicles arriving, different from the black SUVs, unmarked vans with satellite equipment on their roofs. Men in tactical gear unloaded equipment with practiced efficiency. "Who are they?" Jim asked. "Treasure hunters, most likely," Joseph replied grimly. "They've been chasing these horses for centuries, destroying any they couldn't control. They want what lies beneath, but they don't understand its true purpose." Eleanor emerged from the barn, speaking urgently into a radio. More flashlights crisscrossed the property as her team expanded their search perimeter. "We need to move now, while they're scattered," Nora urged. Joseph nodded and carefully led the mare to the spot he'd indicated earlier. He positioned her precisely, aligning her body with invisible markers only he seemed able to see. The horse stood perfectly still, as if she understood her role in this ancient ritual. Jim watched in amazement as Joseph removed a small pouch from around his neck and sprinkled what looked like crushed herbs in a circle around the mare. Then he began to chant softly, the words flowing like water. The mare's markings seemed to shift slightly in the moonlight, the white patches appearing to brighten against her dark coat. Jim blinked, unsure if his eyes were playing tricks on him. "It's beginning," Nora whispered. A faint rumble vibrated through the soles of Jim's boots. The ground beneath the mare began to emit a soft blue glow, barely visible at first but steadily growing brighter. The pattern on the horse's flank was now unmistakably luminescent, pulsing in rhythm with Joseph's chant. "They've seen it," Jim hissed, spotting several flashlight beams swinging in their direction. Eleanor's voice cut through the night air. "There they are. Secure the area." The team converged on their position from all directions. Jim stood up, ready to create a distraction, but Nora pulled him back down. "Look," she breathed. The blue light had intensified, forming a perfect circle on the ground. Within it, intricate symbols appeared, similar to those on the mare but more complex, as if completing a sentence the horse had only begun. Joseph's chanting grew more urgent as men with weapons approached from all sides. The mare remained unnaturally still, her eyes reflecting the blue light beneath her. "Stop right there," Eleanor commanded, striding toward them with several armed men at her side. "Step away from the horse and the activation site." Joseph ignored her, his voice rising in pitch and speed as he completed the ancient words. The ground beneath them shuddered more violently now. "Last warning," one of the armed men shouted, raising his weapon. But at that precise moment, a beam of moonlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the mare and the glowing circle in silvery light. The horse's markings blazed like white fire, projecting their pattern onto the ground where it merged with the existing symbols. The earth split open with a sound like distant thunder. Eleanor and her team stumbled backward as a perfectly circular section of ground, 15 feet in diameter, began to sink downward, forming a spiral staircase that descended into darkness. Cool air rushed upward from the opening, carrying the scent of something ancient and undisturbed for centuries. At the top of the spiral staircase stood a stone arch covered in the same symbols as those on the horse's flank. "It's real," Eleanor whispered, her composed demeanor cracking for the first time. "The repository actually exists." Joseph turned to Jim, his face solemn in the blue light. "Now you understand why your grandfather never sold this land. Your family have been the unwitting guardians all this time." Before Jim could respond, a new voice cut through the night. "Nobody move." Several dark figures emerged from the shadows, weapons raised, different from Eleanor's team. Professional, military. Their leader stepped forward, his face masked. "By order of national security, this site is now under government control. All of you are trespassing on a classified archaeological discovery." Eleanor laughed bitterly. "You're too late, we found it first." "Actually," the masked man replied, "we've been watching this farm for 50 years, waiting for the horse to return and the stars to align." He gestured toward the open spiral staircase. "What lies below doesn't belong to any of you." Joseph clutched Jim's arm. "We can't let them take it. What's down there was never meant for weapons or power. It's knowledge meant to heal, not destroy." The mare suddenly whinnied loudly, drawing everyone's attention. She reared up, her markings blazing with light, then bolted toward the staircase entrance. "Stop that horse!" Several voices shouted at once. But the mare was too quick. She disappeared down the spiral staircase, her glowing markings visible for several seconds as she descended deeper and deeper into the earth. The ground began to shake violently. The edges of the opening started to shift, the stone steps realigning themselves. "It's collapsing," someone shouted. Joseph grabbed Jim's shoulder. "The horse is the key. She's triggering the final mechanism. We have less than a minute to follow her before it seals again for another 70 years. Armed figures rushed toward the entrance from all sides. Eleanor and her team collided with the military group, each trying to reach the staircase first. "Jim," Nora called out, already positioning herself at the edge of the spiral. "We have to go now. The knowledge below was left by my ancestors to be revealed when humanity needed it most. That time is now." Jim hesitated for only a second before making his decision. As chaos erupted around them, with Eleanor's team and the military group struggling for control, Jim, Nora, and Joseph slipped away from the conflict and raced toward the glowing staircase. Behind them, shots were fired into the air, orders were shouted, but the entrance was already beginning to close, the stone steps shifting and realigning faster now. As they reached the threshold, Joseph paused and turned to Jim. "Once we go down, there's no turning back. Are you ready to learn what your grandfather always knew you would discover?" The ground shook beneath their feet as the entrance continued its transformation. They had seconds at most. Jim took one last look at his farm, the land his family had protected for generations without knowing why, then turned toward the ancient doorway and the answers that awaited below. Jim stepped through the threshold with Nora and Joseph just as the entrance began its final transformation. Behind them, the shouts and chaos grew distant as they descended the spiral staircase, following the mare's glowing markings deeper underground. The staircase seemed to go on forever, winding down through layers of earth and stone. Above them, the last glimpse of moonlight disappeared as the entrance sealed completely, leaving them in darkness for just a moment before the walls themselves began to glow with a soft blue light similar to the mare's markings. "The ancestors said the path would light itself for those who were meant to follow," Joseph murmured. At the bottom of the staircase they found themselves in a circular chamber with a domed ceiling. The mare stood waiting in the center, her markings still glowing faintly. Around the perimeter of the room were 7 archways, each bearing different constellations that matched sections of the pattern on the horse's flank. But what took Jim's breath away was the center of the room. Suspended in a column of light was what looked like a living tree, not made of wood, but of something that seemed both solid and fluid at the same time. Its branches extended toward the ceiling where they connected with a map of the stars. "The tree of knowledge," Joseph whispered reverently, just as the stories described. The mare approached the tree and touched her muzzle to its trunk. The entire structure pulsed with light, and suddenly the room was filled with 3-dimensional images, ancient civilizations, healing practices, sustainable farming methods, clean energy systems, and technologies Jim couldn't begin to comprehend. "It's all here," Nora said, eyes wide with wonder. "Everything our ancestors knew, not just my people or yours, Jim, but knowledge gathered from all ancient civilizations across the world. Knowledge that was hidden away when people began to use wisdom for destruction instead of healing." Jim understood now why his grandfather had insisted on keeping the farm, why the horse had found its way to him at the auction. His family had been guardians without knowing what they were protecting. "What happens now?" Jim asked, watching as the images continued to unfold around them. Joseph smiled. "Now we learn. And when the time is right, we share what needs to be shared." For 3 days, they remained below ground, absorbing the ancient wisdom stored within the tree. The mare stayed with them, seemingly at home in this underground sanctuary. They learned of healing practices lost to time, sustainable ways to live with the earth rather than just on it, and warnings about mistakes humanity had made before and was making again. When they finally emerged, They didn't use the spiral staircase but followed an alternative route the repository revealed to them, one that led to a hidden cave entrance on the far side of Jim's property, unknown to those who had sought to control the knowledge below. The farm appeared untouched, peaceful in the morning light. No sign remained of the chaotic confrontation days earlier, save for some tire tracks and trampled grass. Jim's neighbor Tom was waiting on the porch, worry evident on his face. "Jim, where have you been? Those government types tore the place apart looking for you, then left suddenly yesterday claiming there was nothing here after all." Jim exchanged glances with Nora and Joseph. The repository had protected itself, hiding any evidence of its existence once the celestial alignment had passed. "It's a long story, Tom," Jim said with a smile. "One I'll tell you someday." In the weeks that followed, things returned to a new normal. Eleanor and her team never returned. Official records would later show her organization had been disbanded for unauthorized operations. The military presence vanished as completely as if they'd never been there. The mare remained with Jim, her markings now appearing ordinary to anyone who didn't know what to look for. Occasionally, visitors would arrive at the farm, people Joseph had contacted, wisdom keepers from around the world coming to learn what had been preserved beneath the earth. Old Jim wasn't just a farmer anymore. He had become what his grandfather had always prepared him to be, a guardian of ancient knowledge, preserved in the stars and carried on the flanks of a horse everyone else had overlooked at auction. And sometimes on clear nights, Jim would sit on his porch with the mare nearby, looking up at the stars and understanding at last that some treasures aren't meant to be owned. They're meant to be protected until the world is ready to use them wisely.